Hello everybody! Today we're going to go over a real-world example of how to extract and integrate the data we have into a system like a CSV, a database, or in our case, PrestaShop. For today's video, we're going to use a real website, in this case, OO Garden. In order to extract the data from here, we're going to open up the DOM. Oh hey, let's take a look at this. Item prop. Item prop, item type, and related are attributes that are used by search engines to help figure out what each of the elements on a page are. So this indicates that this is the name of the product. This indicates that this is a product type page. We can see down here that this is the price of the product. Since these are standards, they are unlikely to change, so let's use them. So this is the name, clean select, h1 item prop equals name. And now the price. Make sure that there's only one, because these items down here could interfere. They don't, so that's good. And create another variable, price, null again, and finally we'll write price here as post-processing. We'll also get the reference. We can go searching for the reference, and it's a bit annoying that there's extra text we don't want here. Let's see if we can't find the text by itself. We can find it in the Google Analytics. Okay, so this isn't in a CSS selector. So we're going to have to use regex. Okay, so we want content IDs. And there could be some white space in between. So \s. And then we have this. And we'll exclude these, as well as the delimiter. And there we go. Since this is a tutorial, let's say that this is enough for now. Now, we only want to check the page where we have products to extract. This is a bit of a subjective thing, but let's assume that a page is a product page if and only if it has a name, a price, and a reference. Let's go to PrestaShop. We can quickly go there via the button in the lower left. Okay, this is normal. Just click yes. And here, this is where our products we created be stored up here and be updated. So we could just directly type into the database with SQL query, and we'll need the driver, the connection URL, the login information, then our SQL. We could also export the data into a CSV file and then be able to export it into PrestaShop. These are not great because every time I want to update, I'll have to have a CSV file, and there are problems with importing CSVs. Sometimes there are problems with recognizing the reference, and sometimes products are duplicated. Sometimes we have variations on a product, like something could come in blue or green, and that's hard to show in a CSV file. So let's use the PrestaShop module. And in particular, we're going to use PHP functions. Here you can see the different PHP functions. I have here a function to add a product, and I can open the documentation here. And here I can see that the arguments with an asterisk are optional. I can search for a specific functionality, like image, and if I click on a function, I can go to its PHP implementation and documentation to manually change and add things if needed. To call these PHP functions, I can use the PHP function like so. This is a simple function that will output in the console test call. But I can also use function and do the same thing. Here, I'll put the name of my function, and here I will put the arguments. We'll prefer to use the second one because it's a more formal way of doing it. I can use the standard PHP functions, but because we're connected to the PrestaShop module, I can also use the functions we previously saw. In short, there's an include that is done somewhere so that we're able to use our functions. Anyway, let's add the product. So we'll add products, put the name, price, default category, and reference. Okay, right now we've written the code, but if we execute this, the function won't actually run. This function will actually be put in a stack, and it will only be run if we send the function. If I want to run the function now, I can use, functionNow. Add product also returns the product ID, so let's store that in a variable. To distinguish e-commerce variables from server-side variables, we can use camel case for e-commerce variables and underscore for server-side. Okay, let's get the images associated to our product now. It's these here. Let's see. We can see these previews have the image source. And if we take the data zoom, yes, we have the images in high resolution. Now, like last video, we should be careful with the DOM. These images could be generated by JavaScript, and so may not appear in the original HTML. Nope, it looks like they do appear. So we're good. There's even an item prop. Okay, let's go back to the IDE. And since there are multiple images, we'll do a clean select all. Product pictures tag. IMG tag. Item prop attributes. And we want the data zoom attribute. We're going to loop through the different images with a for loop, and functionNow, add image, and here the URL, we need the full URL. Sometimes the images are hosted on the same website, and they'll put a partial URL. So you'll have to add back the other part of the URL. For this website, we don't have to do it because the images are hosted on a different URL. But if we did have to do it, it would look something like this. So I'm going to put image, and I'm just going to set the title of the product as the legend. We also have to add the ID of the product it belongs to. Now, before testing, I'm going to add Fiddler proxy to the parameters. It's not required, but it'll help us see the different HTTP requests that are being made. Now, let's take a look at these initial post requests. these are going to get all of the caches of the website, like its categories, attributes, and variations. Okay, now see, I've made a couple of deliberate mistakes here. First off, notice that I put the code in initial? Nope, it should have been in the for page. Remember, this code gets executed on the page, not at the beginning of the crawl. If I launch now and just wait for it to make the requests, still nothing happens. Doing a debug reveals that the price is empty. And that's because, if you remember last video, you might remember that the selector, by default, takes the inner HTML. Well, there is no inner HTML here, so nothing happened. In fact, if we want to check the code here, which is the code that our crawler is actually parsing, then we can see that we want to select the content attribute. We can check this by modifying the variable, doing Control-Shift-I, and checking that this did indeed work. If we run the code again, we can now see that we now have the functions being called. Let's go back to Fiddler Classic and look at the HTTP requests. So, we can see that for each of the functionNows, I had an HTTP request. This is for each of the add image. Now, this may not be a lot, but remember, there are thousands of products. If we do some quick napkin math, we need one HTTP request for products, one more for adding the product, and 8 for the 8 images. Suppose there are 10,000 products. That's 100,000 HTTP requests. If each request takes half a second to run, that's 50,000 seconds, roughly 14 hours. So half a day. And this is just the tutorial. Imagine if we also add the 7 characteristics: the description, the user manual, the user reviews. That quickly becomes a lot more HTTP requests. We will have to optimize and remove the functionNows. We're just going to keep function. Again, these functions won't be run immediately, only when we send the functions. That also means that nothing is being returned. See, the return type is a void. These functions will go into a stack to wait. I can thus remove this. But then, how do I know the product ID? I need to know where my images need to go, right? Well, we thought about that, and actually, there are what we call context identifiers. If I highlight this function, click this to go to the documentation, I can see that here there's this global variable being declared. If we scroll down past this code that we can ignore, down here, we can see that when we save the product, we're setting this global variable to take on the value of our product ID. If we now go to the code for add image, then we can see that we retrieve the ID product, and if our product ID in the arguments is null, then here we can see that we put the global variable into the argument. So if there's no product ID given, then add image will simply assume that its product ID is the one most recently created or modified. Every function in Grimport is based on this logic, and it should be prioritized. For one, we can see that the code is simpler, and it's also more efficient. If I run the code again, you can see a plus down here. That means that the function's properly executed. If they hadn't, then instead of a plus, you'd see the error message. You may have also noticed that it ran faster as well. If we go back to Fiddler, we can see that there was a lot less HTTP requests. Checking the HTTP requests, we can see that all of the functions were sent at once in the request. And looking at the stats, we can see that although this request took more time, compared to the total time for the previous sum of the 10 requests, that's a big time save. Now, you'll notice we've created the same product 3 times, but this is not what we want to do. Ideally, we'd want for the product to be created if it doesn't exist, and otherwise, we'd update it if it does. Luckily, there's just the function for that. Update or add products. Very apt, I know. Now, there are 2 ways of using this function. Either classically, where you fill out the desired arguments with your values, and the other with null, or with a map, where I fill out the fields I want to fill in, and I remove the rest. Like so. So, what will happen here is that if the function sees that the reference we're giving it already exists, it will go modify the information instead. But now we have another problem. The images. I'm always adding them, regardless of whether or not the product already existed. So, what I'm going to do now is check if the product exists. Since I want to know now, I'm going to do a functionNow. I'm going to do it based on the reference. So I'll take ID product reference, see if the product already exists, and do an if statement to add the images if and only if it doesn't exist. Now, sometimes I don't want to update some fields. For example, after I've created a product, I may go ahead and manually rename the product to be something more descriptive. In this case, I don't want my work to be overwritten by the script. To avoid this, I can use a tertiary conditional to check whether or not the product previously existed. If it did, then presumably I've had the opportunity to modify it, so best to avoid overwriting the data and do nothing. If it didn't, well, clearly I couldn't have modified something that doesn't exist. I can remove Fiddler now. Oops. That's not supposed to happen. Oh, there are some extra quotation marks that I didn't catch. Let me remove them. Now, something you'll notice is that a new button appeared. This button is here because the IDE detected that we created a new product. So we can click this button to go directly to the product page that we created on PrestaShop. Just click yes, and there we go. The product was correctly created. Now, just to show the updated capability, I'm going to modify the name and the price. I'm going to run the program again, and as we can see in the console, something different happened. We didn't create any images. The name had null in its arguments, while the price was updated. If we reload the page, we can see that nothing changed. That's normal, because Firefox is trying to be helpful by making sure you don't lose your previous work you did modifying the product on the page. If, however, we go back, we can see here that the name was kept unchanged, while the price went back to what it was before. We can also see the product was not duplicated. Let's add categories now. So, going back to the web page, we can see that the product belongs to these categories. These categories are in the breadcrumb class, and we're going to exclude the home page because that's not a category. Okay, so we're going to create a for loop for each of the categories and the subcategories, and create the category, press the shop if it doesn't already exist, to place these subcategories in it. Now, here's something interesting. Remember the caches I talked about earlier? It's fine if you don't. One of the caches that was sent to use were the categories. So instead of requesting to the website for the categories, using something like functionNow, I can instead make use of the cache by calling the function getCategoryIn. So, first things first, we need to check if the high-level category exists. Here, it's going to be terrasse, or rather, its ID. We need to check that it exists, then press the shop, and create it if it doesn't. To do that, we need to know the ID of this category. If we look in the URL, we can see that the parent category is 2. So let's initialize our root category to the value of 2 and create a parent ID that initially takes the root category value. These arguments aren't really important, but note that we can use AI to search for a close result. For example, this category here is Salon bas de jardin, which translates to low garden furniture. If you had a category on your website called low furniture, parentheses, garden, the AI will pick up on the fact that these two categories, despite being named different, are probably the same thing. Now then, let's store our new current category ID in a variable. If we didn't find the category, then that means we're going to have to create it. We create it now in order to know where to put our products. Next, we're going to set this category ID as the new parent ID. Because as can be seen here, the next category is in the terrasse category. Since we're mimicking this layout on our PrestaShop site, we're going to go into terrasse to create our next category, Salon bas de jardin. Then we'll go into that category to create the next category, and so on until we've created all of the categories. Importantly, we'll exit with a category ID of the last category on the breadcrumb, which is where our product is stored. So we can add this information to the update function. Before we continue, I'll just mention that sometimes you can end up here, category ID 1, which contains category ID 2. This is not the correct category we want to be in. No, we want to be in category ID 2, the home category. Moving on, I can put this in an if statement to not update the category if it's already created. For simplicity, we're always going to update the category. Now, if I run the code, I will see that the product will have changed position to the correct category. you can see that it attained its original category of accueil as well. But that's because we created this product before we had written the category code. If we had created the product after, we wouldn't have this problem. Now, we have another problem. We're looking through the cache. Now, the cache stores the categories in PrestaShop and doesn't update. That is, if any new categories are added while the code is running, then the cache doesn't update. That means that at some point, there will be a discrepancy between the list of categories in the cache and the categories that actually exist. That means, for example, if we take this, when we check if the category terrasse exists, it won't see that it does exist because we created it after the initial script. We'll have to explicitly tell the program to update the cache here, but let's be smart about it. Let's only update the category if we need to. We'll create a boolean that will be true if we add a category. So, like this. Then an if statement. There's also another way, and this is for when we have bad performance. In this case, we'll use add category cache entry to manually add the category to the cache. It's not as robust because update category also accounts for the fact that categories can be moved or accidentally deleted, requiring it to be recreated. Let's stick to the boolean. I can add here a message down here to give regular updates on the different products that are being added. Now, I'll run this program on the whole website. If I want a status of the crawler, I can press this button, or hit F8 or F9 for two different reports. If I go to analysis logs, then we can see a couple of text files. This one is the list of pages that the crawler has found but not visited yet. And this one is the list of pages that the crawler has already visited. There will also be a text file of pages that the crawler visited at the end of the script, and a file where we tested the extraction. Finally, let's go over some of the options. Here, I can write some regex to specify which websites I should avoid. For example, if for some reason I wanted to ignore ping pong, then I would write, let's see, category 1314. So I would write this here. Thus, if the crawler saw this was part of the URL, it would ignore it. This is the user agent. It's how a browser identifies itself. For example, here we're on Firefox Windows, but we can also be Google, Twitter, Firefox Linux, or even your own if necessary. This is the order of execution. So if I had more scripts here, I could queue up the different scripts using this and run them all using this button in the top left. This is depth. The home page is depth 0, and every time we go into a URL, it adds depth, and every time we exit a URL, it removes depth. And here, we won't go to pages that are of depth 8 or greater. This is a delay between requests. If we send too many requests at once, the website may ban us from spamming or crash from overload. So we space out the requests. This is the maximum amount of URLs to visit, after which we'll end the code. We ideally do not want to hit these two options, but if we do, especially if it's a small website, that probably means we need to exclude some URLs. For example, here we can see that we don't need this link, product detail delivery, so we can come exclude it here. We will see this happens a lot. You'll finish the script, run the code, find that it's taking a real long time. So you'll generate a report, scroll through the links to visit, and realize that, wow, there are useless links. For example, this authentication URL that we don't need to visit. So you'll be able to exclude some links by clicking this button and adding to the regex. And if we reload the file, we can see that if I search for the URL again, it's not there anymore. You can see that the number of URLs has been reduced.
Moving back to the options menu,
this here is how we deal with cookies. When we run the code, the website will update the cookies by adding and removing some. So this means that the crawler will match the cookies. But sometimes we don't want to do that. This is to never follow, and this means that we don't want to update the cookies when we call other pages in the script. So when we visit a new page, absolutely, update the cookies. But if I call the page in the script by using getPage here, then we won't update the cookies. For example, sometimes the price is hidden behind some Ajax, so I'll have to call some other page, like so, and then do clean select the price. Put this code here, and then need to select amounts, and here, when we call getPage to load the Ajax, the cookies won't be updated with this option selected. In general, we'll just want to follow the cookie policy to avoid bans. Sometimes, if we get too many bans, then we use this option down here, which will simulate a Firefox browser and avoid being detected as a crawler by loading the whole web page with CSS and JavaScript and all the bells and whistles. Because usually, a crawler, to be quick and efficient, will not load the CSS and the JavaScript. This is to make a backup. If the crawler crashes midway through, then we'll be able to restart from the last backup instead of having to start all over. Backups are slow though, so generally making a backup every 1,000 URLs is a good amount. This is to parallelize the script. Generally, when we run the script, we do it one page at a time. If I put 2 here, then 2 crawlers will visit different pages at the same time. Coding for multiple pages is different, because we have to manage the cache and variables differently. But that's a video for another time, because this video is already long as it is. This is to export the code and move it to another computer. Now, for this script, this won't be necessary, because the script is saved with the shopware interface here. So, if I go onto another computer, open up Grimport, and interface with this PrestaShop webpage, then I'll find the script. Now, if the script was local, then we'd have an additional option to synchronize the scripts and save it to ID text cloud, allowing it to be used elsewhere. This would prevent us from having to export it every time to work on another computer. And we can copy the ID of the scripts if we ever need it here. Finally, this is to make a copy if you want to make changes, but still need the original. Alright, thank you for listening. This concludes part 6 of this series.